I would just like to point at a few priorities which we have, and then I would like to tell what NATO is really doing, yeah, with the words of the NATO people themselves. Because I mean, Finland and Sweden want to now enter NATO. They want to go into a military alliance. I understand that this kind of procedure is something you could do in the 19th century, but you know, we are in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, the narrative has changed. We have other goals. Paul Mallet just presented, you know, the core of what we want to do and need to do. And a military alliance is not there to provide security or peace. It doesn't do it. It simply doesn't do it. It has other intentions. Yeah? And my peace approach is a little bit more abstract than what Paul presented, because I'm a system theory thinker. And what I present is, you know, I just work on the structure, which is just above the structure we see or we touch. You know, we work on the abstracts of peace. And I'm not going to go into that because this is not my role today. I'm here to explain to you why entering a military alliance is something you could do in the 19th century, but it makes little sense right now. And this can be best seen regarding Ukraine and the conflict we face now with Ukraine. It happens to be that this conflict with Ukraine is a very old conflict. I assisted personally to a session on the 6th of June of 2014 as a silent diplomat. You know, I've been very often the only silent diplomat in the room. There was no other silent diplomat in the room. I was the only one talking for peace in front of 400 warmongers. You know, people who go into the room and say, ladies and gentlemen, we were yesterday in Washington. We asked Obama to give us the orders to march into Russia, but he didn't do it. So here we are today, and we want the orders now from you. Yeah, and this is how a session of this kind starts. These are the first words you listen to when you go into that room. And now you are going to tell me that Finland is going to be more secure, Sweden is going to be more secure entering such a kind of alliance? Sorry, I don't understand it. It's not something that I can, you know, really fully understand or grab. So I would like to tell you, for example, what a member of this conference said in 2014 regarding the problem with Ukraine. There were three representatives which I mainly, you know, kept in my mind because I knew from the session of the 6th of June that the war with Ukraine and Russia was inevitable. It was inevitable due to what American representatives told and said in the room, like Evelyn Farkas stating, for example, that Russia had crossed a red line and that the US would now go after Russia. She expressed it exactly this way, and she explained how she would like to do it. And then there was a State Secretary of Defense from the US, Alexander Vershbow, in the room, you know, just approving her saying and saying, yes, Russia has unluckily now the role of the bad guy, and it will use everything it has to play that role, you know, because this is how we define the other as the enemy. This is how we reinforce the narrative of dominance, because we are right, we are the good guys, we do the right things, yes, and we tell the others how they have to behave. And we do it also with institutions, and NATO is one of these institutions. So in this conference, which is called Overhauling Transatlantic Security Thinking, Soren Ducharu said, for example, one of the things he said is that NATO exists to provide energy security. Okay, first thing somebody in the public said is, what? NATO is going out of area? Why? Isn't it that NATO was supposed to be a defensive alliance? I mean, it's fine if NATO chooses to, for example, provide energy security. It could be something useful to civil society, but is it really? You know what this means, isn't it, in terms of Afghanistan and the pipelines? Okay, so next example, for example, 8 years later, April 19th, 2022, Jamie Shee, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges of NATO. In a network, among other things, he stated, obviously, the enormity of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was bound to sort of oblige NATO to revise its arrangements for collective defense in Europe. After 2014, NATO played, typical of alliances, a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, wanting to put multinational battalions into Central and Eastern Europe to fill the vacuum. And then he goes on, given that NATO's foremost task of its collective defense, it was inevitable that it would have to revise its strategy, and build up its forces in Central and Eastern Europe for deterrence. And because deterrence now means war fighting, it means winning wars and no longer simply hoping to prevent them, at least for the time being. Well, sorry, this is talking violence very clearly. It means we are the rulers, we impose the rule, and the others have to abide. And this is what Evelyn Farkas told in 2014, what Alexander Verspo told in 2014, and they're repeating it now. And Finland and Sweden want to go into such an alliance. Well, sorry, I don't see a way for it. Yeah. And then, as I have to, keep it as short as possible, I would like to just shortly introduce the notions we use for peace building, which, most of them Paul Mallet told. We have structured them a little bit differently. We have talked about soothing conflicts, for example, which implies that the first thing is that we calm the conflict. Why? Because we do not have a criminological approach. We use a victimological approach. You know what the difference is between the criminological and the victimological approach? You look at things from the point of view of the victims. This is what we do in victimology. So in victimology, we choose to stop trauma. First thing, first priority is to stop trauma. And this is not easy because, you have distant parties, like, for example, the MIC, the military industrial complex, who are not interested in stopping trauma. NATO is there to rule by the law of trauma. It imposes, it inflicts trauma. This is what weapons do. So this is why I'm saying we don't need a UN with armies. We need a UN with armies of peace workers, of psychologists, of therapists. This is what we need. Yeah, we do not need a UN with soldiers. Soldiers don't play a role. So, and then what we have to understand is that the first thing is we need to soothe conflicts, talking to the parties interested in the conflict because they make money out of it. And this implies that we go and talk to the people in the MIC. The MIC is the military industrial complex. The second thing we do is offering trust building measures, which come from dialogue. And here I agree fully with Paul Mallet. He's explained everything. Then we do the third thing, which is the consolidation of societies. And this implies also what Paul Mallet said, that we create and work on a really existing economy of peace. And then we run, because we have to heal traumatized people. Yeah, we go from the assumption that in the world, trauma rules everyday life, and that trauma imposes its rules on 80% of the activities of humankind. 20% of humankind activities are empathic. And this is how we live. We live in fear. We live in trauma, and this must stop. So we have to reverse this relation. We have to go from 80% trauma-related behaviors to 80% empathy-related behaviors. And for this, we have to change health. We have to change the impact of trauma on people and also in descendants in terms of epigenetics. And this implies then that once we have done the healing, we can establish functioning democracies. And this implies also that we will have future, because future only exists when trauma is not there. If there is trauma, trauma inhibits future. It doesn't allow for future, because trauma leads to always repeated patterns of behavior. If you want to stop repeating patterns of behavior, you have to stop trauma. That's the first priority. And this is why we changed the narrative. And we changed the narrative in terms of three main principles. First of all, we do not describe human beings. We do not say that the Russians or Putin are our enemies. They are not. They are not. The enemy is the system of violence, which is a complex system. And this system exists in the wording we choose in everyday life and language. It exists in our psyches. It exists in our biology, in the inheritance. It exists in all of our culture. And here we have to really apply the notions of Johann Galtung, which is that we have direct violence, body violence, we have structural violence, and we have cultural violence, which is, the noosphere, which is abstract. And here we have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of, peace work that has been done. So the second notion that we support is that humankind has a single enemy, the system of violence. And our first focus is to reduce the impact of trauma in everyday life. And sexual violence, which is the most common, is priority number one. This is what needs to stop. So I was one of the people who first started working on sexual violence and sexual abuse, rape, and, for example, promoting as much as I could the Me Too movement, and inciting to it. And then third axis, the military cannot provide security. It's completely incapable of doing so. It just depends and exists on economical patterns, depending on some privileges of some privileged families who own these manufacturing sites of the military-industrial complex. And I can name them. It's, for example, the family Koch in the United States. And there are books written about it, about the families, about their existence, about how many generations are creating weapons and dominance through violence. And this needs to stop. It needs to be addressed directly. It's these families that have to be targeted. So this is more or less, what I wanted to state. I would like to make sure that we understand that, I'm not against institutions. I'm not against the UN, but I want the UN to be clearly cut off away from violence structures. And this implies that the UN changes the charter. Article 5, 6, and 7 have to be rewritten. Otherwise, the UN is, for me, no good. And I'm very clear about this. And the result, of the work that we do needs to be funded. There has to be money put into it. I would support any creation of any peace ministry around the globe, but there is no money put in there. Yeah, I've been supporting myself, my family, my wife and myself. We have been paying the peace mission now for 20 years because there is no money. When I asked in Germany, for example, at foundations for the support, in the peace mission I had in Afghanistan, you can't believe what I got as answers. It makes no sense. And the state itself, the government, has institutions, but it's all tied within structures of power. And if you do not have access to the structures of power, then there is no peace work funded. So, for example, the peace organizations in Finland and the peace initiatives founding these peace ministries need money. And this, has to be a very important effort, which I plead for. And companies are the first interested in doing that. Look at what is happening with Ukraine. The war is dismantling, destroying the market. It's destroying the consumption market. It's destroying the energy market. It's like there is no way companies can work. Yeah, it's destroying, the entire output. And I'm not against, for example, thinking it, because in terms of ecocide, we maybe want to reduce some manufacturing. Maybe we want to go to a more simple life. but simple is not easy. And this is why we need to learn the rules, you know, where we come in again with our complexity theory of simplicity, because simplicity is not easy. People tend to go for the complicated things. Yeah, this is where they go. To create a robust, simple system that is adapted to the complexity of humankind as it exists requires a specific effort, and this effort is not being done. So I think that I'm overdue. I thank you for your kindness and listening, and happy to the discussion later.